Hi, Massimo.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Well, let me introduce us. Let me start by saying I'm Robert Wright, and this is The Wright Show. And then let me ask you to pronounce your last name for us.
Yeah, good idea. Massimo Pigliucci.
Pigliucci. It's not what a native English speaker would guess to look at the spelling.
That's right. The GL is kind of silent, and most Americans actually pronounce it hard. So
yeah, I wanted to avoid that. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. You've got a great new book out called How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I have a book coming out in a couple of months, in 2 months, called Why Buddhism Is True, a title that I'm sure I will take some heat for. I should have called it How to Be a Buddhist. I should have been more modest. I should have consulted you.
That would have been much more less controversial. But then again, as you know, controversy does sell books. So.
I'm told that there are people, some of them in very highly placed positions, even as we speak, who became well known mainly for doing controversial things.
That's right.
So I wanted to do a compare and contrast with Stoicism and Buddhism.
Okay.
I mean, you write in your book that you personally find Buddhism a bit too mystical. Its texts opaque and hard to interpret. At the same time, you acknowledge that there really are some fundamental commonalities of perspective between Buddhism and Stoicism. So I thought what we would do is talk, first of all, in a general way, kind of compare and contrast. But then I wanted to get into this this kind of advice column thing you're doing, which is really interesting on your site. We should say you have a site, How to Be a Stoic. We should also pause and say that this book is part of a larger project for you. You have for some time now been kind of resurrecting Stoicism. I mean, maybe not quite single-handedly, but you've certainly been in the forefront, and this book is part of that. And I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think it's for a relatively secular age, when people are looking for philosophies to live by, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the reason I got into it initially was a combination, as it often is in these cases, of serendipity and sort of choices. So one of the things that I was doing is I was actually looking for some time for a better, more organic philosophy of life. I grew up Catholic. That went away pretty. Yeah, not very well. It went over. Went down. It was done pretty early, like when I was a teenager. And then for a number of years, I considered myself a secular humanist, and to some extent, I still do. But the problem is that secular humanism increasingly felt more like a laundry list of things that I liked rather than an actual organic philosophy. And so I was kind of dissatisfied. This was a number of years ago, and finally, through secular humanism, because I rediscovered, if you will, virtue ethics. And the reason for that is because a lot of secular humanists are into virtue ethics, in particular Epicureanism, or Aristotle. The obvious one is Aristotelianism, but some of them are into Epicureanism. And the reason they're into Epicureanism is because of the metaphysics of the Epicureans, right? So the idea that the cosmos came out of a random chaos of atoms, and things like that. And also, even though Epicurus was not an atheist, he certainly was at the very least a deist. He thought that gods are out. If there is a god, it's out there. It's not doing anything, and we really shouldn't be afraid of punishment after death and all that sort of stuff. Those are, according to Epicurus, inventions that are exploited by other people to make us fear things and to do things that we don't necessarily want to do. So I did explore a little bit Aristotelianism, a little bit Epicureanism. I wasn't quite satisfied with either one of them, but I was playing for it for different reasons. In the case of Aristotelianism, it tends to be a little bit of an aristocratic philosophy. Aristotle said that, the eudaimonic life, the life worth living, is mostly a life of virtue, but you also need a few other things. You need to a little bit of wealth, a little bit of education, a little bit of even good looks. And so it's like, I don't know about that. Epicurus was interesting. He said a lot of things that certainly resonated with me. But Epicurean philosophy is also detached from social engagement and political engagement, because the main point was to decrease pain throughout life, especially in pain and suffering, especially of the emotional kind. And Epicurus thought if you get yourself involved in social issues and politics, you're definitely going to ask for it. So don't do it. And I don't think that a good human life is actually acceptable, without a social and political involvement. So I was kind of sort of looking around and maybe even making up my own little version of things. And then all of a sudden, I got a tweet 3 years ago that said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." And I said, "What the hell is Stoic Week?" And I thought about my years back in high school, sort of translated Seneca from Latin, and then I did studies, Stoicism in both history and philosophy when I was young, but it doesn't like what? Why are people doing Stoicism today? But out of curiosity, I sort of signed up for it, and so for a week, I was practicing. There was a different theme every day, a different exercise every day, and I said, "Oh, this is kind of fun." Mm-hmm. And once I finished that week, I actually thought, this is actually interesting. Let me continue for a little bit longer. That year, Stoic Week was in November, so I continued until the end of the year. I got to the end of the year, I said, "Hey, this is actually helpful. It's really, I need to think and learn more about this stuff." And so I said, let me commit to another year. And now we're 3 years later, a book, a blog, and all that sort of stuff. So clearly it's working for me.
Mm-hmm. And we should say, and I forgot to say, that you have relevant credentials. You're a professor of philosophy. You used to be a professor of biology, right?
Right. Yeah, my first career was in evolutionary biology. Mm-hmm. And then a few years ago, I switched to philosophy and in particular philosophy of science.
And are you in the city system? No, you're in the state, New York.
I'm in the city system at CUNY.
Okay.
I'm at City College, yeah.
Okay. City College of New York. So I would think, for starters, one thing that Buddhism and Stoicism have in common is an emphasis on maintaining equanimity in the face of circumstances that might be considered adverse.
Correct.
And, in the extreme case, if you become a true kind of master in either realm, basically equanimity under any circumstances whatsoever, right? That's the ideal.
Ideal, that's right. Ideally, yes. Right.
And is there, I gather, there's a kind of, I don't want to say a ranking system, but I mean, just in Buddhism, there is, there are monks. Well, there are lay people, of course, but then there are monks. And then there are, in theory, people who have attained enlightenment. Now, I gather that in Stoicism, is like sage a formal designation that very few people, well, maybe not formal, but a kind of aspired to level of attainment that very few people reach. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, the figure of the sage in Stoicism is a little bit controversial, even among the ancient Stoics. Some of them said that the sage, or seem to say that the sage is just an ideal. It's not something that anybody can actually reach in their lifetimes. Other people say, somebody can potentially become a sage, but it's a really rare thing. The thing that actually I do like about Stoicism, even, again, beginning with the ancient variety, but also in the modern version, is that, in a sense, to use a Christian way to put it, we're all sinners, we're all imperfect, but so long as we're trying to work on things, we're trying to improve. The term is prokopton, the one who makes progress. So long as we're trying to do that, that's really the goal. As Seneca famously put it, it's like, I'm not aiming at being perfect, I'm aiming at being better than yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Now that leads to a question. I mean, first of all, I would say there's very much a similar kind of argument at least in Western Buddhism. I mean, in kind of Asian Buddhism, I don't think there's any doubt that enlightenment is in theory attainable. Certainly the Buddha reached it. But in Western Buddhism, there's, people argue like, is anyone truly enlightened? And I've talked to people who consider themselves enlightened, or is it just something you would approach asymptotically and never reach? So you have the same argument there. You mentioned this Christian idea that we're all sinners. One thing Buddhism has in common with Christianity is, you could call it a theory of the nature of being human, if not a theory of human nature, that accounts for this problem. So Christianity has original sin. We inherited the sinfulness we inherited something not great that goes all the way to Adam and Eve. Buddhism has something kind of comparable. The idea is you're born with some degree of confusion about the actual nature of reality. Right. And liberation will lie in and just alleviation from suffering, even short of full-fledged liberation, will lie in dispelling the confusion, the ignorance, getting a clearer view of reality. So there's a theory about why we suffer to begin with. Does Stoicism have something like that?
Yes, the Stoics do have something like that. It's much more similar to the Buddhist variety. That is, for Stoics, suffering and unhappiness are derived from the fact that we have fundamental misconceptions about the nature of reality. And in particular, we do not take seriously the so-called dichotomy of control, which is that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and that we should focus our efforts on the things that actually are under our control. And under our control, it turns out, is only our behavior, our values, and our judgments. Everything else is outside, and you should treat it as a indifferent to your ability to live a good life, a life that is worth living. Now, it's not indifferent in the sense that you don't literally care about it. In fact, that's why the Stoics introduced this distinction between preferred and dispreferred indifference, which is a wonderful phrase, oxymoronic phrase, but it does help sort of making a fundamental point, which is certain things you do want to go after, if you can. Those are things like the same things that Aristotle and everybody else will value, education, wealth, whatever it is. Friends and all that sort of stuff, and other things you want to stay away from as much as possible, poverty, sickness, and so on and so forth. But all of those, both the positive ones and the negative ones, are indifferent, meaning that they are not the things that make your life worth living. What makes your life worth living is right judgment and behave, as a person that is a moral person and that is concerned about his or her moral integrity. That's what makes your life worth living. If you're gonna go after riches, for instance, or anything else, any positive, preferred, indifferent, and in doing so you compromise your moral integrity, you do bad things in order to get them, then those things are definitely not worthwhile. You should be detached from them. You should really not care about them.
Okay. So the basic distinction between things that are in your control and things that are not is reflected in the Christian serenity prayer, right?
Correct.
God, how does that go? God grant me the courage to change the things I can, serenity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference?
That's right. And the serenity prayer is actually fairly recent. It was introduced by a theologian in the early part of the 20th century.
It's generally attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, although I think now there's a little controversy on that.
Yeah, as usual with these things.
Yeah.
But I found in researching it for my book, I actually found that similar sentiments are found also in medieval Jewish philosophy. I believe in Buddhism as well. And certainly Epictetus' version is very similar, and it goes back to the 2nd century.
Yeah, I don't think a big deal is explicitly made of that distinction in Buddhism, in part because the aspiration in Buddhism is so radical. It's just like to be able to be indifferent to all forms of adversity. I mean, there isn't as much emphasis on reaching out and controlling the things you can. I should say that, of course, Buddhism is so diverse and far-flung, and because it has been a living and geographically spreading tradition ever since 2,500 years ago. So there's just all these manifestations of it, and there is, I cannot, with very few exceptions, you cannot say much about Buddhism generally. But with that as a caveat,
so let me stop you there for a second. So because when I'm asked by people about the similarities between Stoicism and Buddhism, other than telling them that I don't have expertise in Buddhism, I only read a few things and I talked to a few people like you. But I also tell them that precisely that's one of the major differences in terms of sort of cultural tradition, right? So Stoicism existed in a fairly compact and way between the 3rd century before current era and the 2nd century. The Stoics did disagree among themselves. There were things about which that changed over those 500 years, but not that much. And then there was basically a hiatus of 1.5 millennia or more before modern Stoicism arose. And of course, that makes Stoicism actually a much more compact philosophy and much homogeneous philosophy. When I say it compares with Buddhism, I say but you should think about Buddhism actually as a family of philosophy, or talk about Buddhism in the plural, Buddhisms, because there's a variety of ways of interpreting it, and it has evolved in a number of different ways.
Right, and there's the fact that Buddhism, as lived by most Asians, is a religion, with deities and all that stuff, and the version of Buddhism that has come to dominate the United States, or at least gets the most attention, is more secular, naturalistic. It does put a lot of emphasis on the practices,
right?
Meditative practices, and on the philosophy. But for many people, the religion part has dropped out. I mean, now Stoicism had what we might call a religious dimension. They were basically pantheistic. You alluded to this a little, I guess. Right. So they did have, and there's the idea of the logos, which entered Christianity. So I mean, there's a philosophy about what the universe is and your place in it that at least has religious overtones, right?
Yeah, to some extent that's right. So the thing is, first of all, the Stoics themselves, again, disagreed about the importance of this thing. So, for instance, Marcus Aurelius is very clear over and over in the Meditations. He says, whether there are atoms or there is providence, whether there is chaos or there is a God, it doesn't really matter because I still have to behave in a certain way. I still have to deal with, fellow human beings. So even they were cognizant of the fact that, as a modern philosopher would put it, their metaphysics underdetermined their ethics. Mm-hmm. That is, there wasn't a one-to-one correspondence between metaphysics and ethics. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that while Stoicism was never a religion, there were no temples. In fact, Zeno of Citium, the originator of Stoicism, explicitly said in his book, The Republic, that there would be no temples in an ideal Stoic society. Mm-hmm. So it was not a religion. You were not supposed to worship anybody. But it is true that different Stoics differed in their interpretation of the concepts of providence and God. Some Stoics basically use the word God or Zeus as synonymous with nature or the web of cause and effect. And others where, like Epictetus sounds at times almost like a Christian. He keeps talking about God in a little more personal way. I think it's fair to say that they were, in fact, pantheists, broadly speaking. So they thought that God is immanent in nature and it is physical. And in fact, that we are literally bits and pieces of God. That's how they interpret the logos. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I do like about Stoicism is that it is because the fact that the logos can be interpreted in a number of ways, it is actually a fairly ecumenical philosophy, right? So if you're actually a pantheist, then you're fine. You're pretty much on the same page as the ancient Stoics.
And do you want to tell people what you mean by logos? I don't think we've actually defined the term.
Right. So the logos is this idea that the universe is structured in a rational way, that there is reason in the universe, right? Now, you can take that in a variety of ways. You can say, well, that's the manifestation of the fact that the universe is a living organism that sort of self-organizes. That's the way in which most of the ancient Stoics interpreted. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes them pantheists. But you could also go the Christian way. I mean, the Christians did absorb a lot of notions from the Stoics. And you could say, yeah, sure, the Logos is the Word of God. There is a God that is outside the universe, creator of the universe. And the Logos is Word made flesh or made real. Or you can go the other way, what is sometimes referred to as Einstein's God, which is something that an agnostic or an atheist would be very comfortable with, which is, okay, you interpret the logos as literally the observation that the universe is organized according to rational principles. If it were not, then we wouldn't have science. Okay. We couldn't understand.
Okay, so yeah, there is this, the idea of the logos, it was, had, as you say, a lot of influence in the ancient world. The first, the book of John in the Bible is, in the beginning was the Word. Word is a translation of logos. Right. And would have had the connotations, the kind of philosophical connotations that logos had then, which is more than the word. It was the unfolding of divine will in the form of a logical kind of natural algorithm.
That's right.
Now, in thinking about what Buddhism has, Buddhism does not have the idea of an omnipotent creator God. There certainly is implied a kind of a natural order that you want to accord with. William James defined religion kind of generically. He didn't define it, but he said religion generally is characterized by the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in aligning ourselves with that order, or something like that. And in my book, I argue that Buddhism has a version of that in a couple of senses. One of them is that there is the idea in Buddhism that there's an alignment of three things. Okay, first of all, the things you do to alleviate your own suffering make you a better person. So there's the assertion of an alignment between, you might say, self-help and moral improvement. And then both of those are aligned with seeing the world more clearly. So the quest for truth and clarity is both the quest to improve your own well-being, but also to become a morally better person. And they make a pretty good case. I mean, I kind of defend the case that in the book, but in any event, the premise is that the universe is set up that way. I mean, they don't talk about that a lot, so far as I know, as some kind of evidence of divine will, but there's clearly the sense, and I gather there is in Stoicism as well, that the universe is in some sense benign, and all the more so if you understand that fact, understand the way it works.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's certainly, I mean, everything you said could have been said by a Stoic in the last couple of minutes. The Stoics had a phrase, a recurring phrase, which was that you should be living according to nature. And living according to nature doesn't mean that you should go naked in the woods and hug trees. It means that you should understand how the world works, both the world at large, the cosmos itself, and in particular human nature. You should have the best understanding possible of the kind of being that the human is. And for the Stoics, that the two most important aspects of a human being is the fact that we're a social animal, so we're interdependent on each other, and that we are capable of reason, so that we can apply reason to to improve our life, basically. And as you just said a minute ago, if I understood you correctly, the Stoics also did not really make this sharp distinction that we make today, that is often made today in moral philosophy, between self-interest and other interests. If you help other people, you're helping yourself, but not in a direct reciprocating kind of way, not in a sense of what biologists call reciprocal altruism. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. But just because that is in the nature of a social being. You will feel better, you will live in a better environment. That's what you're supposed to be doing because you are a social being. So in that sense, I really don't see a lot of difference between the two. Now, as far as the universe itself being sort of benign in a sense, I think that was definitely in ancient Stoicism. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, they're all very clear that the universe, it doesn't have a plan as such, but it behaves in a certain way that it's conducive to good action. One of the analogies that both Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius make, which I like, is that when something happens to you that you don't like, that you think, why is this happening to me? One of the ways you should put it in perspective is think of yourself as an organ of a larger organism, right? So you're the foot, and the larger organism has to go home, and in order to do so, it has to step through mud. Well, you as a foot, you're not going to like stepping into the mud. It doesn't feel good. But it is what you do as a foot because you're part of a larger organism, right? So I like that image. I mean, I think that is a very nice image. Now, as a secular person myself, who actually thinks that the universe is pretty much neutral in terms of that sort of aspect of it, I don't feel comfortable buying the idea that the universe is actually somehow organizing things either from the inside or from the outside for the better. I just think the things do happen. But that doesn't mean we're not interconnected. It doesn't mean that, in fact, there aren't roles, both social roles and biological roles, that we play in our lives, and that our lives are going to be much better if we play those roles better. And doing so means understanding what those roles are, understanding how you fit in the rest of the world, particularly the human world, but also the world in general. And that will both make you feel better and actually make things better for you in your life.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how that compares with Buddhism. I mean, one thing we should say is, isn't there part of this idea in Stoicism, I gather, that your welfare and another person's welfare are deeply intertwined, if not identical, is is a cosmopolitanism, right?
Correct. That's right.
These were early cosmopolitans.
That's right. In fact, the word cosmopolitan was introduced by the Stoics' cousins, the Cynics. The Cynics were those people, the word meant dog-like because they were going around sort of living like dogs in the streets, basically, right? They had no possessions. They were very minimalist kind of people. And sometimes very colorful ones like Diogenes of Sinope, who was the guy that famously Alexander the Great went to see, and he tried to be sort of magnanimous and said, "So I'm Alexander the Great. What can I do for you? And you're the most famous philosopher. What can I do something for you?" And Diogenes famously replied, "Well, you can get out of the sun because you're blocking it." So those were the Cynics. Now the Cynics did introduce the word cosmopolitanism, which means literally citizen of the world. Mm-hmm. But the Stoics were the ones that really took it and run with it. Particularly Hierocles, who was a Stoic of the late Roman period. He came up with this wonderful image of the concentric circles. And the idea was that you can imagine yourself at the center of your own circle of concern. There's you, and then outside of you there is your family, and then outside your family is your friends, and then there is your fellow citizens, and then the people that inhabit your same nation, and then finally the world at large, right? And the idea that Hierocles said is like, look, since we are all members of the same family, really, what you should try to do in your mind is to contract these circles and bring them closer and closer to you. And he said, in order to practice that, so that this is not just a theory, you should go around referring to other people as brother and sister, or depending on their age, uncle and aunt or something like that, in order to basically constantly remind yourself that you're literally, in fact, all in the same boat. You're the same family, even though they're not directly related to you. Mm-hmm. That was the first early articulation in the Western world of the concept of cosmopolitanism. Although Socrates himself, which was a big influence on the Stoics, famously said, don't ask me if I'm from Athens or Corinth. I'm a citizen of the world. Mm-hmm. That's the basic idea.
I would say Buddhism, in terms of the idea that your welfare, there's no real distinction in a certain sense between your welfare and someone else's, or at least no distinction between the importance of your welfare and the importance of theirs. Either way, I'd say Buddhism gets there largely through a different path. Certainly one avenue to that idea is the Buddhist idea of not self, the idea that the self is an illusion. That has a number of dimensions to it, but one of the dimensions is the idea that the bounds of the self are in a sense illusory, right. And this is an actual meditative apprehension that you can have. You can get to the point where you kind of feel that degree of continuity, right, between yourself and everyone else. Now, there's a subtle philosophical argument that we should largely avoid about whether, that means we are all one or actually we are all nothing. Hindus would be more inclined to say we are all one because they believe the self does exist. Yeah. And that ultimately the self is really absorbed in the larger kind of universal soul. And so that's what, Buddhists, because of this other doctrine of emptiness that's important in some parts of Buddhism, some of them are reluctant to say we are all one, but the ethical implication is the same, right, which is that there is no difference between you and other people. And interestingly, if you talk to people who are really, really adept meditators and have gotten to depths greater than ones I will ever get to, some of them actually say they feel this. They just don't feel a strong need to feed their appetites. Right. And they don't feel that their well-being is more important than that of right, others. So
now, the Stoics have something very similar, but they do arrive at it from a different perspective. So the Stoics do believe that there is a self. They think that not necessarily a self in the sense of an essence of you, but the self as in you're recognizably distinct from other beings like you. But first of all, the fact that we're all bits and pieces of the universe and we're all bits and pieces of the logos makes it so that at a very minimum yourself is not more important in any sense than anybody else's. But as I said earlier, it's actually more than that. It's really that your welfare benefits from your own life benefits from the fact that everybody's life is getting better, that society is getting better. But the way they arrive at it is also via meditation, but in a very different sense, and a sort of meditation based on reflection rather than more like a Zen variety of what I'm thinking of. And the reflection is this: they tend to insist over and over that you should keep thinking about what your place in the universe is, and this is sometimes referred to as the view from above kind of meditation.
Right. You actually visualize. That's a visualization exercise.
Right. It is a visualization exercise, or Marcus Aurelius does it as a sort of in writing. Basically, he writes to himself. He says, remind yourself every time that you have a problem, every time you have an issue with other people, remind yourself of the big picture. You think about the extent of time, think about the extent of space, and the role and the part that you are within it. And you will see that A, your particular concerns are actually not that important, but also B, that you are connected to everything else, and that therefore the rational thing to do for you as a human being is to try to do your best to improve societies at large. So they arrive at a very, very similar ethical conclusion, but from a different metaphysical starting point, I think. Okay.
Well, maybe at this point we should do what I said we'd do and get into this. Actually, I'm not sure how far along I got in describing what we were going to do, but the idea is to look at your advice column, which I mentioned, which you have at your website, How to Be a Stoic. Look at a few questions that people have written in that you try to answer from you give them guidance from a Stoic perspective, right. and see if I can after we talk about how the kind of Stoic guidance you give them, see if I have anything to add from a Buddhist perspective.
Sure.
And maybe one thing that'll happen in the course of this is we'll get a chance to elaborate a little on the differences in meditative practice, because I know there are varieties of meditative practice in both traditions.
Sure. Yeah. Before we start, let me explain how we got to this to the column itself. So at some point, somebody started writing to me and say, one person wrote to me and say, "Oh, I read your blog and I'm interested in the practical aspects of Stoicism, not just in the theory, so I have a question for you," right? And this was in an email. And I looked at the question, I thought it was interesting, and I said, look, yes, the reason we're doing Stoicism to begin with is not for the philosophy or the theory, it's because the philosophy and the theory actually bring practice to every day and improve everyday life. And it would be really bizarre to say that you want to do that and yet you don't have anything to say about specific questions from everyday life, like the ones that we're going to talk about in a minute. So I said, but on the other hand, I don't really have the time to sort of engage in a one-on-one correspondence with people. I wish I did, but I just don't. So I made these counter proposals, and I said, would you mind, since other people might have the same problem, would you mind if I actually answer you on the blog, of course, taking out all of the personal details? And the guy said, yeah, absolutely, you can do that. As soon as I did that, my intention initially was not to start a column, but as soon as I did that, I got flooded with questions. And the advice column, which I now try to publish every Saturday morning. There is one that's coming out, in fact, tomorrow morning that I just finished working on. It's by far the most popular aspect of my website. It's the people just go there on a regular basis, which makes me feel useful, because it looks like you're actually doing something that is useful to other people, and it's perfectly congruent with the whole idea. Again, I'm interested. As a philosopher, I'm interested in the philosophy, of course. As a sort of thinking person, I'm interested in the philosophy. And I'm also fascinated by the history of Stoicism, the history of the sort of Greek and Roman civilization. But really, I studied it because this made a difference in my life. So it makes perfect sense that that's the main channel of communication with other people as well.
And does it ever scare you that people are making consequential changes in their lives in response to your guidance?
Scare is not the right word. Concern, yes. you kind of feel responsible for it. But, I tell them, look, this is, you ask for an opinion about a particular issue from a Stoic perspective. There are other perspectives. I keep telling people that, this is not the only way of looking at things, of course. But if you ask for advice, this is what it comes down to. And in my mind, and of course I even say as a disclaimer that other people who practice Stoicism may actually have a different opinion about what a Stoic would do under those circumstances. I do try to be careful about what I advise and how I word it, and especially every column is backed up by what I think are appropriate quotes from the ancient Stoics. Now, one disclaimer here: I don't think, as we were saying earlier, Stoicism is not a religion. So the ancient Stoics are not scripture. It's not that just because Seneca or Epictetus said something, then that's the way it goes. But of course, if I do use them, as I do in my own life, as sources of wisdom, of timeless wisdom in my mind, then it makes perfect sense that if I say, okay, this is what a Stoic would do, then I'm going to back that up with citations that are appropriate to the topic.
Okay. So let's take a question that you have answered already. Someone writes in, I am a filmmaker based in India. Lately, I've had a very tough time with my career. I feel like I'm working hard, but I just can't seem to catch a break. I mean, I write my scripts, I follow up with people, and nobody responds. It's like I'm just being rejected. He goes on to talk about how many of his peers, I think it's a he as I recall, but if it's clear, many of his peers have succeeded. He has failed, and so it's kind of a failure narrative. And you want to talk a little about how you thought about that?
Yes. So the first thing that one does under any kind of circumstances similar to the person that was writing is you bring up, of course, the dichotomy of control. Say, well, what is in this kind of situation? What is it that's under your control and what is not under your control? Mm-hmm. Under your control is the effort, for sure. And it sounds to me like the person did make an effort for a long period of time, and he's trying his best. What is definitely not under your control is the outcome, and that's not necessarily because you're not good enough. I mean, that may be one explanation. I mean, regardless of one's own opinions about how good one is, it may very well be that he's just not that good of a filmmaker. But there are also a lot of other things that enter, a lot of other variables that enter into it over which you have no control. There is the state of the industry in general. There is the amount of money that may be flowing through that particular industry in India at this particular time. The competition you have, the kind of topics that you chose that may not be particularly popular, not attract funding, that sort of stuff. So once you make that very clear to you, it's the goal shifts. It becomes a question of not staking your self-worth on the outcome, but rather on your effort. Mm-hmm. Did you really try to do the best you could? Are you actually or should you actually rethink about the way you were going about it? That's the first step. The second step is, look, at some point, whether you're not succeeding because you're not good enough, or you don't succeed because the conditions are simply such that it's very difficult to succeed, then you have to make a decision. How long do I want to go about this sort of thing? And there I brought up actually the example of a friend of mine who is a journalist, another area which is not exactly going through an easy period. It's not easy to find work as a journalist, and I do think she is very good. I've seen her pieces. I know how she writes, but I also know, because I have several friends in that business, how tough it is, and it's getting only tougher with time. So she tried for years. She was reasonably successful as a freelancer, but you can't make a living out of it as a freelancer that easily. You have to be really stellar in order to do that. And so at some point she took a look at the situation. He said, well, look, I gave it, whatever it is, how many years of trial. I sort of barely made it. It's not good enough. Now it's time to move on and do something else. That, I say to my Indian friend, is an example of practical wisdom. So one of the four virtues in Stoicism is practical wisdom, or what the Stoics, the Greeks called phronesis. And this is the idea that you need to practice the ability to make the best decision that is available to you given the circumstances. So not the best decision, period, because there's no such thing. But the best decisions, all things considered, given your actual situation, not a theory, not a sort of an ideal situation, but your actual situation. What is the best decision you can make? And nobody can tell you what to do or what not to do. They can only remind you that one of the four virtues is that one, and you should try to sort of put it into practice. the last thing that I said to that person was, he mentioned casually in his letter that other aspects of his life are going very well. He's financially secure. He has a good relationship, things like that. And so I seized on that and I said, look, seems to me that there may be a danger here, that you're actually too focused on one aspect on your life that is not going well, and you're not sufficiently appreciative of the rest. Because I said, not many people can actually say that they are financially secure, emotionally secure, they have a good relationship, and so on and so forth. There is a lot there that you do have. And you are at risk of actually jeopardizing it by keep going in a direction that is not working out for you, because, that causes stress, that causes financial, issues, that causes, your partner might at some point say, hey, wait a minute, how long are we going to go with this kind of thing? So I said, another thing you should probably do is to, in fact, sort of refocus and take a step back, talk about the view from above, in a sense. Take a step back and say, okay, what about my life in general, not just that aspect? We are not just a filmmaker or a professor of philosophy or whatever it is. We are human beings. So Epictetus has this really interesting approach to ethics. It's called role ethics. So the idea is that we all play different roles, right? But the most fundamental role is that of a human being. And then there's individual roles that are, your profession, you're a partner, you're a father, you're a son, you're a friend, and so on and so forth. These other roles will come into conflict at some point or another in your life. And the way to resolve these conflicts is, according to Epictetus, always to go back down to the more fundamental level and say, okay, but what kind of human being am I? Mm-hmm. What am I doing here? What is the big picture? Step back for a second. What is this picture? So what I finally advised to him in practice, I said, look, at this point, take a close look and see if, in fact, there are other ways, more creative ways of staying in the same business, but maybe not as a director, maybe doing something else. And in fact, he followed up with me just a couple weeks later, or even the same week. And since some time had passed, actually, from the moment in which he wrote the letter and the moment I was actually able to get to his question and answering officially, so already more than a month had passed. And so he said, well, not only I appreciate all the points you make, but in fact, I actually followed your advice before I even read about it, because he's now actually, in fact, trying to stay into the same general sort of business, but from a different perspective. In other words, trying to be a little bit more creative and use the obstacle, in a sense, as a way out, or as a way around, and doing something different, while at the same time still being engaged in what he actually cares about.
Mm-hmm. Now, I gather that one resource you have when you answer these questions is that there was a certain amount of this kind of explicit guidance given in as part of Stoic kind of discourse in the ancient world. So, I mean, you can say, yeah, they talk about this kind of problem, yes, and what you should do.
Yes, they did. Now, both Epictetus does with his students in the discourses. You can find a number of examples where evidently some student asked him a question or posed him in front of a particular problem, and Epictetus really addresses the question directly from Stoic principles. Marcus Aurelius does it to himself. Mm-hmm. The Meditations was actually, in fact, entitled originally to myself. Because it was his personal diary, so he actually sort of talks to himself about certain problems that he's having and how to address it. But probably the largest source by far is Seneca. Seneca is by far the Stoic of which we have the most extant writings, and not only we have a number of complete essays and books that he wrote about all sorts of topics, but we have this wonderful, absolutely wonderful resource, which is the Letters to Lucilius. Lucilius was a close friend of Seneca, and he wrote 100 and something letters, 104, 105 letters to Lucilius on really all sorts of topics. Mm-hmm. From the big ones, like, how do you deal with approaching your own death or something like that, to the trivial ones, like should I go to a party and how should I behave when I go to a party? Mm-hmm. So Seneca is a wonderful source.
Yeah, because I don't think in Buddhism there is quite the counterpart to that. I mean, there was, I shouldn't pretend to be conversant in the entire Buddhist canon. It's immense, and it varies from tradition to tradition. But I think the Buddhist discourses this is partly well, I don't know, but they see the ones that have become best known, the ones uttered, purportedly uttered by the Buddha himself, seem to be have more to do with philosophical matters in a way than specific practical matters. Now, it ultimately is a very practical philosophy. It starts out with the idea of ending suffering. The meditative techniques are very well geared to that, but there's not as much kind of advice column stuff in the in the Buddhist canon. Now, I should say, I think, if you ask the average meditation teacher what to do in a situation like this guy's situation, you would get a lot of the kind of guidance that you've given, I think. But there's not the same kind of ancient resource that I think you have to draw on.
That's interesting. So I actually think that even within Stoicism, where there is a fairly sharp difference between the early Stoics, the so-called early Stoa, and the late Stoa. So the early Stoa was based in Athens. So Zeno of Citium, who studied out the whole thing, Cleanthes, who was the first head of the Stoa after Zeno, and then Chrysippus and a couple of others. Now, we don't have a lot about what they wrote, unfortunately. We have only fragments or things that are cited by other later authors, often actually hostile authors. And sometimes we have a lot of citations from the early Stoics by Cicero, who was not a Stoic, but was sympathetic to Stoicism. So we don't know a lot about it, but from even the titles of the books that they wrote, and those titles actually are preserved by Diogenes Laertius, it sounds a lot like they were actually more interested in sort of metaphysical and philosophical issues rather than directly practical things. I mean, again, Stoicism did start out immediately as a practical philosophy, but it seems like I think it's fair to say that the early authors were actually more philosophically minded than practically minded. Then, what happens was that Athens fell under the control of Rome, the political control of Rome. They made the mistake of aligning themselves with King Mithridates against the Romans, and the Romans beat the crap out of both Athens and Mithridates. And so Athens basically lost its preeminence as both a political power, well, that one had already been lost under Alexander, then after the Peloponnesian War, but also as a cultural capital of the ancient world. And that moved to Rome, particularly during the early empire. Now, so the Stoics, most of the Stoics that we know of, and most of the ones that we have a lot of writings from, are actually Roman Stoics. And the Romans, unlike the Greeks, were actually well known for being much more practical. Right? So the Greeks were into geometry and mathematics. The Romans were into engineering and building stuff. And so I think that actually shows through. That's why Epictetus' discourses, Seneca's letters, and so on and so forth are actually very, very practically oriented. They absorb the philosophy, the Stoic philosophy. They agree with the general principles, but a lot of their focus is actually on practical stuff. I mean, Seneca writes, as I said, letters to his friend. He also writes letters of consolation for friends who are grieving after the loss of somebody. Those things are not found in early Stoicism. They are a Roman phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to another question that you were posed with, and this will actually come to think of it. This is an example where the Buddha, there is fairly explicit guidance in the early text, I think, but this is somebody who's angry with their relatives.
Yes.
Which actually, I'm in that situation. I mean, first of all, 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. And secondly, we're in the middle of planning a family reunion that has led to a certain amount of email tension. Okay. So this is good for me. But this is someone who, again, I think somebody in India, right? What is it about India? But this person, like the last person, is in India, but I think going to college in the West, and so and they predictably, when they return home, they come into a family situation that I guess they describe as what we might call dysfunctional, and they say, and I get angry. I get angry with my father. I get angry with my mother. And so how do I deal with anger toward relatives? Is what you. Yeah. So, and you say?
So there, the answer is somewhat different from the previous case. So anger is a big deal for the Stoics. The Stoics write a lot about anger. Seneca wrote an entire book on anger, which is actually still very much modern. I mean, a lot of the advice that you find in Seneca on both so in his book, he goes into analyzing the phenomenon of anger, as well as giving you practical advice on how to deal with it. And I actually checked the website of the American Psychological Association, the APA, the Psychology APA, and they have a section on anger management, and it reads almost verbatim like Seneca. I'm not saying that they actually took it from Seneca, but it reads very much the same. So to begin with, Seneca says, look, anger is a negative emotion. It's a destructive emotion, and therefore something that you want to control. Now, the Stoics, let me take this opportunity to sort of clear up one very, very common sort of misunderstanding about Stoicism. The idea that Stoicism is about suppressing emotion. It isn't. The way I think about it is more about realigning your emotions, sort of moving the spectrum of your emotions from the negative to the positive. So you're supposed to control and sort of overcome, if you will, negative, destructive emotions like anger, fear, and hatred. But you're also supposed to be nurturing positive emotions such as love, concern, sense of justice, joy, and things like that. So Seneca says anger is a temporary madness. Even when it is justified, even when you actually, there's good reasons you're angry at somebody or at something. If you act on it, if you act on your anger, you're probably going to regret it. Mm-hmm. Because anger takes over reason. You're not reasoning when you're not thinking straight when you're angry, and so you're going to be doing something that, even though it was motivated possibly by a righteous, let's say, reaction to something, it's still not going to be the right course of action. So what you do want to do is to, he says, you want to cut your anger as soon as you feel it beginning to boil inside you. If you let it go for a little bit, it becomes uncontrollable. The way to do it is immediately. As soon as you feel that, disengage. Put some of what modern psychologists would call cognitive distancing between yourself and your anger. And he actually says, practically speaking, what that might mean is simply you just physically disengage from the situation. Go for a walk. Go take a walk around the block. Or another later Stoic author who was advising an emperor about anger said, okay, before you answer anything, if you feel yourself being angry, before you answer anything, before you do anything, just run very slowly through the entire Greek alphabet. So 24 letters, one by one, little by little. So it's the equivalent of our count until 10 before you act. Mm-hmm. So there are all these little suggestions on how to do it on the moment, right? That's if you're feeling angry, you disengage. But what I also said to my correspondent there is like, okay, but you actually know about what's going to happen way ahead of time, because you say you live in the United States and then you go back home to India, and you're going to be getting angry, and you know exactly what the situation is, why you're getting angry. Okay, so now at that point, what you need to do is two things. One is the one that we already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into details again, and that is about the situation itself. You apply the dichotomy of control. What is it about that situation you can control? Can you actually control your father's violent outbursts or himself getting angry or something like that? You probably can't. There is not much you can do about it. This has been happening for many years. This is the result of long history that he has. So there too, you need to apply the dichotomy of control. But more importantly, since you know this is going to happen, there is another technique that the Stoics used a lot, and it's sometimes referred to as the premeditatio malorum, which is Latin for imagining bad shit happening to you. So, right? So the idea is like, that this is going to happen, so you meditate on it, you reflect on it ahead of time, you visualize the situation, you're familiar with that situation because it's happened several times, and you get comfortable with the situation ahead of time before it happens. Seneca says a prepared mind is the best way to react to problems. If the problem hits you on the moment and you don't know where it's coming from and you have no idea how to respond, then you're probably not going to respond well. But if you can visualize it ahead of time, if you can think about it, you can reflect about it and say, okay, I know this is going to happen. Epictetus does something really nice. Actually, there's a bit in Enchiridion, in the manual, where he says, look, every time you go out, think about what may happen. So let's say that I want to go to the thermal baths, right? I want to take a bath. Well, you know that if you go to the baths, there is a good chance that somebody's going to splash you, somebody's going to, yell, somebody's going to push you, that sort of stuff. Now, what do you do then in order not to ruin your experience? you say to yourself when you go out that you have two goals in mind. One is to have a good time at the baths. The other one is to keep in harmony with nature, right? So which in Stoic parlance basically means keep in harmony with yourself and keep a certain degree of control over your reactions. If you fail to the first one, meaning that if somebody's actually ruining your actual experience, you're not going to fail on the second one. It's the first one is outside of your control, but the second one is in your control. So you should prepare ahead of time mentally. If necessary, go over the situation over and over and repeat to yourself how you're going to act on it and how you're going to actually handle that situation. And the situation will be better. Will get better. I mean, I do that all the time, and it does actually get better. The third and last thing I think that I said in response to that letter was like at some point we got into the person got into the family history and he mentioned briefly that his own father possibly is a somewhat violent, not really. I didn't get the impression that he was physically violent, but it's like outbursts of anger,
right?
Thing, because in turn he was brought up in a family where his grandfather, this guy's grandfather, so the father's father, behaved in a similar way, and so on and so forth. So I say, okay, one of the Stoic principles is that of charity about other people. You don't. Epictetus says often, don't judge other people because you may not know enough about their circumstances to actually arrive at a judgment. Try to simply redescribe what they do in neutral terms. So you can say, for instance, don't say that somebody drinks too much. Say just that he drinks a lot by comparison to average. Don't try to redescribe it in as neutral sense as possible, so that you're not going to judge that person from a moral perspective because you might not know enough. So in the case of his father, I say don't say he gets angry for no reason. He says his behavior becomes altered, and there are probably reasons why he does that. There might not be good reasons, and this is not necessarily it's not a good behavior. But try to be charitable, because being charitable is often a good way to sort of diffuse the situation, right? Instead of confronting and getting yourself upset also, and sort of then it gets into an escalation of shouting match or something like that. Try to look at it as charitably as possible, and sort of look at your own father with compassion, with the kind of compassion you should look at really every human being.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so there's a certain amount there, I think, in common with Buddhism. Certainly the recognition that anger is not a great thing. The Buddha said, I think the phrase was, anger is the poisoned root with the honeyed tip. Which evinces a recognition that although, you think of anger as, in one sense, unpleasant, there's something that's attracting you to it.
Sure.
And in general, one thing about Buddhism is over the centuries, and I should say that in general, I think the things attributed to the Buddha, it's not always clear whether he said them or they're, as generally happens with these figures from back then who didn't write stuff down right at that moment. Jesus,
bastards. I mean, they should have written.
Right. What was he thinking? There did develop in Buddhism a really elaborate psychology. It's compiled. A lot of it's compiled in something called the Abhidhamma, which is several centuries after the Buddha. But in any event, there's the meditative discipline led to a lot of careful introspection, just observing the mind at work, and this led to a lot of insights into things like this kind of dual-edged nature of anger, more broadly, how subtly our affect influences cognition and so on. So I think it's one of the real strengths of Buddhism. I mean, not that everything in the Abhidhamma would make sense to a modern psychologist by any means, but I do think there's I think at the core of Buddhist practice and philosophy, in a way, is a very subtle appreciation. It's not always very explicit, but a very subtle appreciation of the way of how subtly affect and cognition can be intertwined, which is now a finding of modern science, but I think is very much anticipated by Buddhism. Now that's kind of a little bit of a detour. What I'd say, a clear commonality. You use the term cognitive distancing. Now,
right.
I haven't heard that in a Buddhist context. But but there's certainly there is something that is functionally the equivalent, and it isn't like physically remove yourself from the situation or anything like that. But I would say certainly with mindfulness meditation, a lot of what mindfulness meditation is about, and it's about a lot of different things. But one of the things that has been central, especially to the modern use of mindfulness meditation, but can be found in the ancient texts, is a focus on feelings like anger and all kinds of other feelings that is in a certain sense objective. It's a kind of objective awareness, and it's kind of hard to describe. I mean, I should say I've been, I'm not like a great meditator, but I've been on a number of meditation retreats of 1 week or 2 weeks, and when you in that expanse, even if you're not a habitually great meditator, you can get into some interesting places.
Yeah.
And when you really achieve, and I should say you can do some of this in a daily practice, especially if you've been on a meditation retreat, but when you get to this point of objectively viewing your feelings, it's a kind of interesting paradox. On the one hand, you could call it a kind of distance, because it's definitely an objective view. You can almost literally see them, and the seeing of them in this objective way drains them of their emotional grip on you.
Right.
It can be like you can view your own anxiety much as you would view a piece of modern art in a museum. It really is, it's that objective. But on the other hand, the term distance is misleading, because the way you obtained that objectivity is by getting very close to them in a certain sense. And that's especially true with unpleasant emotions, where normally the instinct is to get away from them. Fear, anxiety.
Right.
And it's getting into a calm enough state of mind to just accept their presence, and in that sense get very close to them and not run away from the unpleasant emotions. Yeah. That gives you some cognitive distance from them. Yeah. And just one more thing. I think there's a recognition that, you said, well, look, you're going into this situation, so be prepared. And yet, precisely because anger is, I forget how, I think whether it was Seneca or whoever described it, but it's like temporary madness, right? It's like
Seneca, right?
It's like precisely because of that, we've all been in this situation where we go, I'm not going to let her push my buttons this time. And then you walk in the room, and you're screaming, and I think the part of the idea of intensive meditative practice is look, it would be great if you didn't have to spend an hour a day. Right. But the way emotions are in the grip they have on us is, if you want to go through your day with an appreciably enhanced ability to kind of just see this stuff coming and head it off at the pass and not be drawn into it, it's gonna take practice, and there's no alternative.
No, you're right. That is why often in my columns I insist on the difference between theory, understanding something sort of cognitively, and then internalizing something. And I say, Stoicism is probably less than 10% theory and 90% practice, meaning that you have to repeat over. And the Stoics themselves did appreciate that. They had these pithy phrases, these short phrases that they kept handy to repeat themselves over and over, almost like mantra, in every situation where they would apply. Mm-hmm. And they would go often to the others and reread passages or write down their own thoughts over and over. I mean, one of the things that Marcus Aurelius is often bizarrely criticized for is that the meditations are repetitive. But people don't understand it or forget that this was not meant for publication. This was his own diary, right? So the fact that the reason that it's repetitive is because he runs into the same problem over and over, and he catches himself and says, okay, you did it again, now try more. Now, one thing that I wanted to bring up about anger in particular, but in general emotions, is in Stoicism is this. There's this really nice way of understanding it, I think, which is the idea of giving or withdrawing assent from emotions. So let's take anger, right? So if you start pushing me, let's say all of a sudden, out of the blue, and physically pushing or something, my immediate reaction is kind of anger, right? That reaction, the Stoics said, there's nothing you can do about it. This is a natural thing. If somebody it's like a reflex. It's like if you come too close to me, I kind of withdraw, right? I can't stop it. There's nothing. That is not under your control. Right. But the kind of anger we're talking about like in the case of the person that wrote to me, is like, you know it weeks ahead or months ahead that this is going to happen. So this is not an immediate reaction. This is actually a cognitive assent. That is, you actually have agreed to yourself that it's a good idea to be angry about these things, that you should let yourself doing that. And so Epictetus says, every time you have they call it impressions, these first reaction that you have about things, every time you have an impression, talk to it and say, look at it from a distance and say, well, you are an impression, but let me take a look. Are you really what you seem to be, or are you something else? Should I actually give you assent? Should I actually take you on board, or should I actually reject it, exercise my decision of rejecting assent? In that sense, I think this is actually very much in coherent with recent research in neuroscience. There's this book that I now, of course, forgot both the title and the author, but I'll look it up later, that came out recently, like in the last year, that makes this distinction between the way in which neuroscientists and psychologists think about an emotion, like anger. So for neuroscientists, when neuroscientists do research on anger, usually they refer to the immediate reaction, the instinctive one, the amygdala that suddenly starts producing hormones, and you feel in a certain way. But the psychologists tend to focus on the cognitive aspect of that kind of emotion. That is, on the idea that you actually, in a sense, implicitly agree that this is a good way to feel, that this is a good way to react, and therefore you keep doing it, even though you might actually stop yourself from doing it. So there's that's the same distinction, I think, that Epictetus was making between the impression, over which you can't do anything, and the assent to that impression, which you can.
Well, that has a real counterpart in mindfulness meditation. I mean, the idea is you examine these things as they come by and decide which ones you want to get on board with. So, we've been at it more than an hour. We probably shouldn't go on much longer. I want to say one more thing that's kind of relevant to the first example we had of the filmmaker who, by his account, was a failure. I think one thing both Stoicism and Buddhism have, and I don't think this is like many things, or like some things in the way Buddhism is kind of taught in Western venues these days. It may not be all that explicit in the ancient texts, but it's kind of it is a logical kind of consequence of the foundations of Buddhist thought, and it's the idea of recognizing that narratives are just narratives. I doubt the Buddha ever said that's just a narrative, but it definitely is really near the heart of Buddhism to understand that many of the things that are making you suffer are just mental constructs. It's like the way this guy is framing his recent career. A lot of as you say, look, if you can't make a living, then you should be doing something else. At the same time, to some extent, you seem to be letting other people define failure. If you're making a living and doing work that intrinsically brings you happiness, don't buy in. You don't have to buy into the larger narrative. And I think, this kind of gets back to basic mindfulness practice of examining the emotional impact of things, and it reminds me of something that a meditation teacher said to me once he was a teacher of mine on a retreat. He said, cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been connected to both Stoicism and to Buddhism, he said, that consists of kind of talking people out of their narratives, like saying, is it really rational to fear this, or do you really have to look at it that way? And he said that's fine. That's fine, but if you want to go really deep, you get beneath the level of narratives altogether. You don't spend any time buying into or talking yourself out of them. Now, I should say, this is one of these teachers who has done so much meditation. He's in the general realm where you could argue about whether he's enlightened. Okay, so this is somebody who's gone much further than I've gone, but I do believe that if you wanted to go that far and undermine kind of the idea of narrative almost, it does begin with sitting and examining the emotional impact associated with a narrative. I mean, he could do that. He could sit down and think, I failed, until finally he gets enough distance to look at what that feels like to him. the impact that's having on his emotional system, failure. I think that is one way to approach his issue, and that is a way to just get away from the narrative long enough to, if nothing else, examine it objectively, and then ultimately maybe, as this meditation teacher suggested, get into a whole new zone with respect to narratives. But the main thing I wanted to end on, and I should say, you know, maybe down the road we should do this again once you've compiled a whole bunch of more of these advice. You know, your advice column is going on. We could do this again, and we could talk about Stoicism and Buddhism again. But I want to get your reaction to this idea that there is a big emphasis on the fact that so much of what makes us suffer is a mental construct.
Well, absolutely. That's another big area of similarity or overlap between Buddhism and Stoicism. Epictetus is very explicit about this. He says, you know, it's not the things out there that upset you, it's your judgment about those things.
Right.
You know, those things are things that just happen. You know, the universe is this way. You find a job or you don't find a job. You find a partner, you lose a partner. Things happen. You know, the universe is like that. It works like that. Cause and effect everywhere. Now, however, what upsets you cannot possibly be a fact because, and in fact, the way he presents this, he tries to convince his students of this. He says, look, if something bad happens to somebody else, like, you know, even serious stuff, like your spouse dies or something like that, right? Well, our first reaction is to obviously commiserate the person, you know, say feel, you know, human empathy. But then we also say, but, you know, these things happen and you need to accept it and eventually you recover and you move on. But then it happens to you, Epictetus says, and it's, oh, poor me, it's the end of the world, right? It's like, wait a minute. Weren't you saying just a minute ago when it happened to somebody else that it is part of the way the world works and that you should really try to look at it differently? And so his conclusion is try to look at your own things with the same level of sort of detachment distance from which you look at people when those things happen to other people, because they're not the things in themselves that upset you. It's your judgment of them. Mm-hmm. And you are in charge of your judgment, at least to an extent. You can change it. You can reframe things. You can think about your life differently. And, you know, a lot of modern critics of Stoicism, of which surprisingly there is a good number, say, oh, but that's just a mind trick. Sure, yeah, it is. But you know what? We navigate our world because of our minds.
Moreover, I mean, your ordinary perception is a mind trick. That's the whole point. It's all a mind trick.
It's all a mind trick.
Now, exactly. And I will say, in Buddhism, the aspiration is get to a point where there are no mind tricks, and that's a territory we could talk about at some point. Sure. Now is not the time, but the point is that I think what Stoicism and Buddhism have in common is don't act like your mind isn't already playing tricks on you. Are you crazy?
Exactly. Try to choose the trick that is most beneficial to you, as opposed to just accepting the one that comes by default because other people, perhaps, other people's judgment impose that on you.
Right. Okay. So, well, maybe we should down the road. You know, there's a lot more we could talk about. I'd hoped we'd have time to talk. You know, someone asked you about someone who had cancer asked you, you know, very deep questions about the prospect of death and so on, and that's something we shouldn't rush through. So we should probably save that. But let's do this again. And meanwhile, everybody should buy How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. It's a very pretty... now, I've seen two jackets. Is there both a hardcover and a paperback, or what?
No, one is the American one, the one with the leaves, and the other one is the UK version.
That's the classical...
That's the classical looking
one. They're both beautiful. I really love the classical.
Yeah, they did.
They're both beautiful. Yeah. And basic... Yeah.
Most people do like the classical ones.
But they're both really nice jackets. Yeah. And Basic Books, your American publisher, is a great publisher that does, you know... They're right at the intersection of like academic and trade publishing. I mean, they're a trade publisher. They're not an academic publisher, but they only do high-end intellectual serious stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's a great house to be at. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And we will we'll talk again.
It was a pleasure. Yes, anytime.
Same here. Take care.